What's up everyone? Welcome back to the channel for the latest Q and A. Let's jump right into things. So let's start with question number 21, which I think is a great question, very widely useful for a lot of people. And I hope my answer is useful as well. It is generally accepted that the guideline for optimal, and I'm glad you put that in quotes, muscle growth is between 10 and 20 sets per muscle group. Which muscle groups would require the least/most? Would it be dependent on exercise selection? So first of all, it's going to be individual. You have to experiment, blah, 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 nuance. But I do think that there are going to be general trends here. Particularly the back probably will require more. I think this is for two reasons. First, because a lot of back movements are most challenging in the contracted position. If you only go to failure or the same number of reps in reserve as with other muscle groups, you're really not taking on as much stress as other areas because you're only failing in that, contracted position, especially with rows. Also, the back is kind of complicated. I mean, the chest, sure, you have like upper chest, lower chest, but a lot of them, it's just working together as a whole. You just have one chest. And you have one back, but there are multiple different muscle groups. You have the spinal erectors, which are responsible for erecting the spine. You have the lats, which are responsible for shoulder extension, bringing the arm down. And then you have the traps, which are responsible for moving the scapula either upward or retraction or depression or upward rotation. And then you have the rear delts, which could count for the back kind of. You have the rhomboids, you have the rotator cuff. So there's just more stuff that the back can do. The chest, mostly just bringing the arm across the body. But the back, there's so many more functions that you just need more exercises to target all of those functions. And if you think about it, if you're doing a strict row, a chest supported row, you're not working the erectors at all, And if you're doing, flared out to the side, you're not really working your lats much at all either. You're only working one of those three functions. So you are just going to need more sets, and you might even want to break that down into each particular muscle group, potentially. All right, question number 20. Is a small surplus, 100 to 300 calories, sufficient to put on muscle? Well, first of all, that's a pretty big range. 100 to 300, that's a big difference between how much of a surplus there is. Also, for who? Is this a beginner that we're talking about? Is this someone who's more advanced? You could argue that if someone is more advanced, they're not going to put on as much muscle, therefore they don't need as much of a surplus. But you could also argue that because it's more difficult for the advanced guy to put on muscle, he might need more of a surplus, right? And so I think sometimes people say, okay, well, I'm only going to put on 2 pounds of muscle this year. That means that theoretically I only need like a 25 calorie surplus per day. And then, they end up going nowhere and they think that they're done when they could have gained if they had been, willing to put on a little bit more fat. In general, though, I think this is a pretty reasonable range. And if someone is not gaining muscle on 300 calories, which is going to be about 3 pounds of weight gain roughly per month, it's probably your training. It's your training or it's your sleep or it's your stress management. And I would not just pile on more calories in the hope that that is going to move the scale in terms of muscle group. It'll move the scale, but you might not get the result that you want. All right, question number 19, quite an interesting one. Can a normal trainee, I don't know what that means, who's an abnormal trainee, right? Work up to your training every day with initially bridging the rest days with small accessories, slowly adding bigger movements, and finally to a 7-day-a-week routine. If it's possible, is it even worth building up to that, or normal rest days and cardio would be objectively better for training longevity? So I guess they're referring to the fact that I train every day or most days. And I would say you can build up to this. Just look at it as training stress. If you're spreading your stress across 7 days or 6 days or 5 days, 7 days might allow slightly more training volume or training stress because you're just sprinkling it in over more days. But I don't think the difference is going to be huge. Every day that you add gives you diminishing returns. So if you go from 1 day to 2 days, that's going to be better. For sure. 2 days to 3 days, I would say, it's still going to be better. 3 days to 4 days, yes, but again, you're getting diminishing returns. 4 days to 5 days, if you can't make gains on 4 days a week, something is probably wrong unless you're very, very advanced. And then 5 days to 6 days, probably very minimal difference. And then 6 days to 7 days, like probably no difference at all. Would it be worse? I'm not sure if there's anything special about a day off. Maybe you could say it's useful, but it's certainly not necessary for everyone. And I just take a day off when I feel like I need it. If I wake up and I'm feeling, just groggy and beaten up or something, or if I'm busy, then I take a day off whenever I want. And for me, if I want to take a day off, it's a sign that I should take a day off. But for a lot of people, if you're on like a 3-day per week plan and you're like, I'm not really feeling it, if you're not really, really driven and motivated and you're prone to, slacking off or missing days, you should probably be more disciplined with showing up. But for me, if I want to take a day off, I should. All right, next question. What are some realistic muscle size gain measurements for the first 5 years of your lifting career for arms, legs, and chest in inches? How much can you gain every year or in total 5 years? I know it depends from person to person, but what is the average? So I actually don't know the average. I do know that after 5 years of lifting, I had roughly 16-inch arms, I think a 42-inch chest, and my legs were right around 24 inches or so. But I also don't know where I started because I wasn't taking any measurements then. I would say, I know the average guy has 13-inch arms in the US, but that's probably a lot of fat. And I was certainly under that because I was fairly skinny. So I would say I was probably like 11 or 12-inch arms. And so I put on roughly 4 to 5 inches on my arms, maybe 6. I'm not sure entirely. My chest measurement, again, I don't know this before. I'm guessing I put on, if it's proportional to the arm growth, and I think it probably roughly was, I probably put on, 10 inches on my chest, maybe 8, 12, I don't know, somewhere in there. It's hard to say. And then my legs, maybe I started at like 18 or 19 inches for my legs. But again, this is kind of hard to tell. It depends on where you start. I mean, if you're overweight when you start, you might put on nothing in terms of your chest measurement. If you've got, big old man titties, and then you cut first, which I think is a good idea, and then, 5 years later, maybe you're the same body weight, and maybe your chest measurement is fairly similar, but it's, that fat has gone away and you built muscle instead, and it could be that you have the same exact measurement. Same thing with your arms. If you have like fatceps and then you diet and then you build muscle, your arms might end up conceivably at the same exact measurement. And so, yeah, it's sort of hard to tell. But if you start out and you're, 100 pounds and you're super underweight, you're a skinny teenager and you go from, say, 15 to 20 years old, I mean, shit, you might put on 8 inches on your arms. So it's hard to tell. And I don't think these expectations are particularly useful anyway, because what are you going to do? Change your training because you're falling behind what you expect in terms of every year in your arm measurements? I'm not sure how useful that actually is. Next question. Let's say you need to train for a push-up contest, as many in a row as possible, no stopping. What's your game plan? So I would do a lot of push-ups in a row without stopping. I wouldn't necessarily take every set to failure. I think this is where, because you're going to be doing very, very high reps, I think going to absolute failure on push-ups is very, very challenging. I find it actually more challenging than like a barbell bench press going to failure, because you have like the core, you have like, you could be, losing tightness there, you could be sagging, you could be sort of arching and stuff like that. And so I would probably do a lot of work with a couple of reps in reserve. And I know that sounds like blasphemy, but I would say that's probably better than just like, yeah, I take every set to absolute failure. I would think that's probably not the best strategy for this goal. I would probably also diet down a little bit, because even though it's not as drastic as dips or pull-ups, moving less body weight is still just going to be easier. And so I would probably go back down to maybe 11 or 12%, somewhere around there, where I still feel strong, but I'm moving less weight. But I'm not going to do that because I don't care about this. By the way, this video is sponsored by Boostcamp. It's a fitness app where you can log your progress. You can check it in the gym. You got the app. You can scroll and input your values and, oh, bench press. I'm getting stronger. Fantastic, because I have good programs, which are also on the app. Like me, I have 2 or possibly 3 programs up there. You also have programs from Bald Omni Man, Alexander Bromley, Alberto Nunez, and a lot more. These programs are great. They'll get you jacked. They are well tuned, and they are going to be very effective. And so you can check out that if you want, if you're interested in that. It is free. I will leave a link in the description. And thank you to Boostcamp for sponsoring this video. All right, next question. It's advisable to do cardio and rest days for our work capacity, but how do you feel about sprints? I heard sprints are quite taxing and use a lot of type 2 muscle fibers. Assuming you're talking about running, sprinting, I would look at this as a leg day, so don't put it before or after another leg day just because you're not going to be able to perform, assuming you're sprinting fairly hard. This goes with hill sprints as well, but to a lesser extent. You might think that, because the joint angles are more similar to squatting when you're running up a hill, it's going to be more taxing. Well, no, because there's a lot less impact, like a lot less impact. If you're doing flat sprints on a track all out, especially if you are fast, if you're not that fast, it's not as taxing, right? But if you're actually fast, 100% flat out sprinting is very taxing. I don't even think necessarily on the central nervous system, but there's just a lot of impact, a lot of stress on the joints, a lot of eccentric loading, especially through the hamstrings. And so, this is going to be at least as stressful as a leg day. If you want to sprint, but you're going to have to program it in. Unlike lower intensity cardio, where there's no impact, it's more regenerative, more restorative. And so you can program cardio in a lot more easily than sprints. And so if it's actually a goal, that's fine, but you're going to have to change your program to accommodate that. All right, next question. Question number 15. How much of a difference does the source of your micronutrients make for muscle growth and recovery? Is the effort of creating a nutritious meal versus a smoothie or pill beneficial to a normal gym goer? So I actually think that a lot of lifters are probably deficient in magnesium, zinc, perhaps several other micronutrients. It's not something that most people get tested, right? It's not something that most people are really concerned about, but bodybuilding doesn't prevent deficiencies. A lot of people think like, oh yeah, I lift, I'm healthy. Yeah, but you might even need more than the recommended daily allowance if you're really pushing yourself super hard in the gym and you just have greater energy expenditure. And so I would say, yeah, it might matter. And if you're, subsisting off of only shakes, you might have issues, at least in the medium to long term. Short term probably doesn't matter. But overall, yeah, it could matter. I mean, if you look at most professional bodybuilders, yeah, they might have the supplement company sponsorship and they're pounding the shake and they're making a big deal about it, but they all eat real food, right? Because that's going to be better for growth. And I wouldn't say it would be different if you're natural. If anything, it's even more important because you have to support your hormonal health more directly. So I would say, yes, it does matter. Try to have as healthy and nutritious of an overall diet as you can. You can supplement that with shakes, but that should be a fairly small part of your diet. Next question, do exercises actually ever get stale? Should I switch them out when they stop progressing or rotate them on a weekly basis like NH says to do for hypertrophy? I personally prefer keeping things in a little bit longer. I do have more flexibility in my programming now than I used to, which I'll get into in a later question. But I would say start with more consistency, see how much you need, and then allow yourself the freedom and the flexibility to switch things out a little bit more frequently. I think also when you're stronger, a little bit more frequent rotations might make sense. But if you're a beginner, I think you won't really be as in tune with your body, and so you won't know if you're switching because it's useful or if you're switching just because you're getting bored and you're having, programming ADHD. And you're, oh, this shiny object syndrome, oh, this, oh, I should switch this. I heard about this. And, if you're a beginner, you should be making very fast progress, but a lot of people aren't because they are, constantly program hopping. And you can learn a lot from program hopping, but you have to give the program some time to work, which is going to be more than a week or two. So I would say if you're a beginner, just learn to stick with one program, follow the rules until you're more advanced, and then maybe you could bend the rules a little bit later. Thoughts on splitting up workouts throughout the day, throughout multiple days? Pull-ups plus push-ups in the morning, rows plus chest flies in the evening or the day after. Thanks. Hope things are great. Keep up the good work. Oh, thank you. I don't necessarily like this, but I also don't think it would be super detrimental. I think it's probably more about your overall volume of work. And if you find you can progress this way, maybe you're very, very busy, you're a new parent, and you're just squeezing in mini workouts whenever you can. That is going to be much better than missing workouts, having a big formal workout plan and then, something comes up. So if you're very, very busy or if you just don't have that much time all at once, mini workouts are totally fine. I don't particularly like doing it that way myself personally. Hey GVS, been a huge fan of your content for the past 6 months. You're killing it. Thank you. Rocket emoji. Quick question. For a newbie struggling with a regular squat due to lengthy limbs and duck feet, yours truly at 6'5", which I think in centimeters is like 190 something. Would you recommend a permanent switch to machine hack squat / leg press, or should we power through with squat variations? Cheers for the awesome insights. Looking forward to your take. So if you have a goal of squatting, you should squat. So powerlifting or just seeing what you could do as a personal challenge, you're going to have to squat. You might want to supplement that with the other stuff, though, just to get in some more direct work. But if you don't have a goal of squatting, you don't need to squat. There's no obligation to squat. I wish I had actually dropped the squat earlier. You can maybe do like a plat style squat, but if you have long femurs and maybe even just like ankle mobility restrictions or hip mobility restrictions, even that might not be a very, very good option. And so, yeah, there's nothing wrong with doing a machine hack squat or a Smith machine hack squat or leg press or some other squatting pattern that is going to take the hips and the lower back out of it. Just because longer limbed people, yeah, they do tend to be more hip dominant just due to their leverages, and they tend to sort of good morning this squat up a little bit more. And if your goal is big legs and this back squat is not giving you what you want, zero issues dumping it. Again, I wish I had done it sooner. I haven't back squatted in a while, and my legs are still progressing very, very well. So choose something that you can progress at consistently and which works for your body. Not that you have to work to fit your body to the exercise. That doesn't make sense. You are the master of your own training. All right, next question, sort of a lengthy one, but a good one. Do you think adding intensity techniques on every movement, such as drop sets, rest pause, forced reps, etc., actually work more effectively than just doing straight sets? Or is it just like junk volume, where the trainee is tricking themselves into thinking they've done more, but instead just wasted time and effort? Would you prefer to add more straight sets to your current movements, or add in intensity techniques as a way to progress? By the way, love your channel and keep up the good work. Thank you. So, I would not add them on every set, on every movement. If you're doing that, I think it's a sign that something is wrong. These are the spice that you kind of sprinkle in sometimes. I personally prefer not to spend any more time in the gym or to do more sets, and so I do add these things in, particularly rest pause and sometimes slow eccentrics or slightly cheated reps, etc. But for me, I know how to go to failure, and I'm not using it to avoid failure, but be really honest with yourself. Because I see a lot of people, I saw a guy the other day, he was doing, I think, triceps pushdowns. He did a quadruple drop set, and not one of those drop sets, not one of those mini sets, was anywhere near failure. I saw zero speed slowdown in the reps. None. And I didn't go up to him. I wasn't like, bro, you gotta stop being a bitch.
I was born with scum like you. I am from the gutter too.
Like that kind of, no, I didn't. No, I just was like, all right, well, I was curious why he's feeling the need to drop the weight when he's not even close to failure. But, okay, whatever, your choice. Maybe you'll learn from a lack of gains at some point. But I would say for most people, focus on straight sets, focus on good technique, focus on going near failure, then to failure before you decide to go beyond failure. This is beyond failure work, and so if you can't even go to failure, don't worry about going beyond. Just focus on getting to failure first. I wouldn't necessarily say that it is junk volume. It could be if it's just, fluff and pumping around, which is fairly common. But if you are actually pushing yourself, it's not junk volume. And, I've seen studies where drop sets are just as effective as straight sets, and yet they are much more time efficient. So if you're busy, this kind of stuff can be very, very useful. But I would say there's no hypertrophy that you can get for the vast majority of trainees that you couldn't just get from straight sets. All right, next question. Question about back training. How should the spine and scaps be positioned/moving when training upper back versus lats? Should one round and extend the thoracic spine in addition to protracting and retracting when training upper back? Should the scaps be protracted, neutral, retracted for lat training? You just got to go by feel, man. Yeah, just go by feel. Nah, that's kind of a bullshit answer that I often hear. Like, oh, you just got to go by feel. Well, like you should have some idea of how you're moving before you just go by feel. Because sometimes you'll feel like something is working, but it's not actually doing something, or vice versa. So, if you're doing a row, you have two things going on. So you have the upper back rounding and unrounding, the extension and flexion of the spine. And then you also have the scapula, retracting and protracting. And those two things kind of, to a certain extent, go together when you're rowing. You'll see someone, if they row forward, yes, their scapula is going to protract, but often there's some upper back rounding that goes with it. And then when you're contracting, there's going to be some extension of the spine as well. You're getting that chest up position. And so they kind of go hand in hand, even if they're technically two different functions. Like one is the traps, one is the upper back spinal erectors. And so if you try to focus on only one, it feels kind of like an awkward movement, right? Like if you're not moving your upper back at all and you're just moving your scapula, it's kind of hard to hit failure, because it's like a lot of other movements where you only hit failure and then you're like, oh, you're just done. So I think adding a little bit of upper back rounding can make the movement feel more natural. Now, if you only do the rounding, if you're only doing that and not like moving your scapula, it's actually kind of difficult, because again, these things are sort of meant to move together. And so if you want to work your traps, I think it's okay to get some upper back rounding. But if you add in too much, you'll actually end up getting a stretch on the lats as well, right? Because your lats, it's going to be more shoulder extension as you start the pull. So if you want to work just purely upper back in a row, I would use a wider grip, allow some rounding, but don't get like all the way hunched forward, because then you're going to be working the lats a little bit too much. So keep fairly upright, and then you can, stretch forward a little bit, but not too much, and then try to, contract at the end. And that contraction will probably be accompanied by some extension. And then for the lats, let's say you're doing a neutral grip pull down. If you're trying to do it when you're fully retracted, it's actually difficult to do, right? If you're trying to reach upward and you're retracting your scapula, you can't even do it, right? You can't even actually get fully overhead, right? Because you're like trying to retract, you can't even do it, right? And then if you're protracted, you also can't do it, because you're fully out here, and then you're like, I can't, you can't even, it's like if someone's standing on your back and you're trying to sort of lift your arms up, it just doesn't work. And so I would not worry about protraction or neutral or retraction for lat training. You'll probably find that your scapula will move. It'll upwardly rotate a little bit at the bottom, and you'll get some extension as well, just because that's what feels right. And then at the top, I wouldn't worry about trying to retract or protract. It'll be fairly neutral. And this is something that try not to overthink too much, because that can allow just a lack of training effort and a lack of progression, and it's just not particularly productive. Often your scapula will just do what is needed to get the job done. Next question, if limited by equipment, are squats and RDLs enough for leg hypertrophy? Enough for what? Enough to have, pretty good legs? Yeah, I mean, the RDLs, working your adductors, your hamstrings, your glutes, and then the squats are working your adductors, your quads, and your glutes. And so, yeah, you're gonna be working pretty much the whole leg, but they are both working the lower back pretty extensively. So again, if you are a tall bro, a long-limbed, sort of spidery kind of guy, squats might not be that productive. RDLs are usually pretty good for just about anyone. So you might get more value from other movements. And this is where you can probably do single leg work as well. Those are usually, quite useful and a nice addition if you're limited by equipment. You could do front squats. Those are a good bet for quad growth generally. You could do good mornings potentially if you have a power rack. I wouldn't do those if you don't have a power rack. And so even if you're limited by equipment, you should probably still be doing other things, different squatting variations, different hinging variations, especially if you want to maximize your leg development. Plus, I think it's the short head of the hamstrings. It actually doesn't cross the hip. It's only a knee flexor. And so you can do all the RDLs in the world. It just is not going to work that muscle group at all because it doesn't do that function, right? And so you're going to have to do some kind of leg curl as well. Plus the rectus femoris in the front of the thigh. That is not going to be worked a lot through squats. Maybe if you're staying very, very upright, you're allowing the knees to go forward. It's a lot more knee flexion than hip flexion. That might work a little bit of rectus, but it's just usually you're going to want some kind of sissy squat, some kind of leg extension, something that is not going to be working hip extension because that is going to sort of shut that muscle group off to a certain extent. And don't get me started about calves. All right, next question. Is it okay to train a muscle that is still sore, or is it better to wait until it's fully recovered? So I tend to base this off of a few things. First, the actual muscle group. There are a few muscle groups that I'm a little bit more wary of. Chest and biceps. Those are ones that do seem to be a little bit more prone to tearing, and so I think you have to be slightly more careful on those. If your biceps are like weirdly sore and you have preacher curls that day, be more careful than if you have like sore upper traps and you have to overhead press. Like, you're not going to tear your trap overhead pressing. Someone's probably done it sometime, but that's not really something to worry about. Hamstrings as well, I think you need to be a little bit careful about. Quads, not so much. Triceps, not so much. Lateral delts, side, rear delts, probably totally fine. You're not going to tear your forearm, etc. And so, if your forearms are sore from whatever you've been doing, that's probably completely fine. I would say you can also go by feel. If something is feeling better and better during the workout, let's say your quads were sore and you're squatting, and they're feeling fine, you're moving well, the blood flow is good, you can feel them on the way down each squat, but it feels pretty good, then you're fine. But if you're going through the workout and it's getting worse and worse, that's where that's where you probably want to pull the plug on the workout, which is not easy to do sometimes. But man, let's say you're doing RDLs and one hamstring, that's another thing. If it's like a side-to-side thing where one side is fine, the other side is acting up, be careful with that as well. Let's say you're doing RDLs and your right hamstring is like, hey, we got a micro tear here. It's turning into a macro tear. So, chill. If someone decides to add a set to an exercise, i.e. 3 sets of a row instead of 2 sets, do they tend to see a drop in performance for exercises that come after it? How would you personally implement additional sets to an exercise? Yeah, that's very possible. If you suddenly increase your volume, yeah, it might be harder to progress on other exercises. And so you kind of have to have a mindset shift where, if you increase your volume slightly and you're maintaining performance on the later exercises, sounds like a win to me, especially if you're more advanced, right? You repeated performance despite, being in a more fatigued state. Now, if you're seeing a drop in performance, it depends on how much. If you do 9 reps instead of 10, maybe that's understandable. But if you get 5 reps instead of 10, something has gone astray in your programming. I would say, why are you adding in sets? Were you progressing fine before? If so, don't add in sets. How were you feeling? Were you feeling like beat up and stressed and you weren't recovering? In which case, don't add in sets. Only really add in sets if you have stalled and you're feeling good. Okay, if those two things are both not true, I don't really see the point in adding in sets. Sure, maybe your progression might be better, but it also might not be better and it might be worse as well. So if you're still progressing, just progress. If you're not progressing and you don't feel great, then don't add in sets. Find some other way to troubleshoot. My books will help with that quite a bit. And only add in sets if you are not progressing and you feel good and you feel like you could do more. Question number 6, how important do you think fatigue management actually is, i.e. deloading every X amount of weeks? Some popular science-based channels make it seem like if you train to failure for a few weeks, you're going to fall apart without a deload from the fatigue. But I think I've heard you say you almost never deload. That's true. I don't really like deloading. I don't have formal deloads. I will occasionally take time off if I'm traveling or if there's a vacation or some kind of family event or something. And so I don't really feel the need. If I feel like I'm overdoing things, I pull back sooner rather than later. I think sometimes people, they train too much, and they dig a really deep hole, and then they have to deload. Whereas if they had made smaller adjustments earlier, they would have been able to just keep going. And so, making these smaller course corrections more frequently and more proactively, I think is totally fine. And, some people get dogmatic about deloading. If you find that you can still progress when deloading and that works for you, totally fine. My issue is when people are like, you have to deload, or it's necessary, or if you don't deload, then you're not training hard. And that's where I'm like, okay, well, I'm still training hard. I'm still making progress. I'm not deloading. I'm just choosing a different way to manage fatigue. Now, is fatigue management important overall? If you have the ability to create fatigue, yes, you need to manage it. A lot of people, they take days off. They're not as serious about training. They're not pushing themselves. And so I would say for 80 to 90% of people in the gym, they don't really have to worry about fatigue because they're not creating very much fatigue. But if you're serious about things, if you have actually dug a hole before, not overtraining, but if you've if you fucked yourself with the training before, basically, which not many people have, then yes, you need to manage it a little bit more acutely. And so I do, but I tend to do that more frequently rather than taking formal, big, official deloads. Partly because I don't like that kind of easy training, and I also find that it makes me lose my momentum, and I'm actually weaker after a deload, which is not the case for everyone, but I personally always find that to be true, and so I don't do it. Next question number 5, regarding variation in one's program. Personally, I'm a big fan of taking a single exercise and using rep ranges as a means of variation, i.e. decline press 6 to 10 reps on Tuesday, then 10 to 15 reps on Friday with slightly less weight, of course. Love to hear your take on the pros and cons of this practice and your thoughts on programming variation in general. So I actually really like this because when you vary the rep range, especially significantly, it is a different movement. You'll notice different sticking points. You'll notice it just feels different. And the greater the difference in rep range, the greater the difference will be in how it feels. So, let's say you're doing close grip bench press for sets of 4 to 6 one day, and then 15 to 20 the next day. Those are essentially different movements, right? You might find that the sticking point is higher up with the higher reps. You might find that your tempo is slightly different. You might find that it might actually help recovery. I would say 10 to 15 is a little bit low to get that helping with recovery effect, but 15 to 20, especially 20 to 30, you might find that it's actually restorative and recuperative, if that's a word, for your joints, especially on some movements. If you're doing high rep push downs, yeah, that might actually make your elbows feel better than if you had never done that volume at all. Now, I wouldn't necessarily recommend very heavy isolation movements, but I've done those in the past. I've done sets of 4 to 6 on push downs, on overhead work, on curls. And so, yeah, I think it can work. I wouldn't necessarily do sets of 4 on lateral raises or something. But yeah, I do like this. Plus, it's similar enough that you do get the practice in.
Practice? We're talking about practice, man.
right? So they're different movements. They're stressing the joints differently. You might be getting that restorative effect, but you're still getting touches on the bar, which might actually help your progression. And they kind of help each other. The low reps can build the high reps because you're getting better post-activation potentiation. I guess it's not post-activation potentiation because it's not in the same session. But I have found that progressing with lower reps helps drag up your higher reps. And progressing with higher reps, to a certain extent, probably a lesser extent, at least for me, higher reps can help to build your lower reps and build your very specific, the most specific, work capacity as well. So yeah, I like this. I think it's a good idea. Probably not in every single movement. Some things you want to actually change the movement as well, but it can certainly work. All right, next question. I've noticed lately you're training with a more intuitive and free approach where maybe you don't always do the same exact exercises, number of sets, and so on. How do you manage it? I would also like to do this, but I have no idea how to do it without risking ruining any kind of progress. Thank you. So I think there's a few things going on here. I have been less structured since the end of my cut. I think this is partly just burnout, burnout from, I think I just trained way too hard that last month. I was doing 20,000 steps, getting 3 or 4 hours of sleep. I didn't reduce my volume very much. I was still doing a lot of sets. All the sets were still very close to failure. And so I think I just kind of got a little bit burnt out. And, so I sort of just took, a more intuitive approach, a more freeform approach, something where I just sort of went in and was like, okay, what do I actually want to do? What is actually going to motivate me to keep training? And so I wouldn't say this was, completely varied. It wasn't, I didn't go full conjugate, but, there was a more frequent swapping of exercises, which I am not going to say is quote unquote optimal or ideal, but it's what I wanted to do. And if I had too much structure at that time, I probably would have just not been particularly excited about training. And I've had times when I was completely freeform. Like I didn't even have any structure at all. I didn't have a split. I would go in and be like, all right, what do I want to work today? I think that is where that cannot work for the vast majority of people. Maybe if you're super, super advanced and you're just maintaining, sure. But for most people, you do need some kind of plan, some kind of structure. And so for me, it was more like, oh, on a bro day, I can add in a different curl if I want to, right? Because that's not as neurological. You can, progression is not quite as important as the bigger compounds. And so I would just say, okay, well, I want to do a long rope push down. I want to do a short rope push down. I want to do an overhead extension where I'm standing, where I'm leaning away, where I am bent over, Now I'll add in some skull crushers or something like that. And so I think with arms and with a lot of these machines and isolations, more frequent swaps can actually work a little bit better. Next question from the one and only FidLab. What's up, dude? Genuinely curious, what's the most ridiculous fitness-related question you ever received was, and how do you handle it? Man, I get all kinds of DMs. I get a lot of DMs per day. I'm always intrigued by the very medical questions where someone is like, I have this disease. What should I do? What should my training be? How the fuck? I've gotten people who are like, I have cancer. What should I do? Really? You're throwing your cancer at me. You're gonna toss over your cancer and ask, some random fitness guy on the internet what you should do. And so I just usually just either don't respond or I just, say, hey, maybe consider talking to your doctor. I don't know. Like maybe that's a good idea rather than asking me. I've had like heart disease questions, blood work questions. Someone's like, my LDL is here. What should I eat? Really? Like, I should get paid for this shit. In fact, no, I shouldn't even get paid for that because that is way outside of my area of expertise. So I'm always shocked by like just the broadness of the scope. Political stuff, I'll get religious stuff, I'll get historical questions. Some really personal stuff, relationship questions. I'll get some intrusive questions about like my life, not just in China, but like my personal life and stuff. And man, some people just they don't really think about what they're asking, and it can be. At this point, I usually just don't respond because when you let someone into your DMs, they now have the ability to DM you at any point, and I probably get 40, 50 plus DMs a day, And yeah, it can be a little bit overwhelming at times. I try to keep up with things, but just to run the numbers, if I have 130,000 subscribers, which is awesome, by the way, and kind of mind-blowing, if 1% of those people each DM me once every 2 weeks, so only 1% of the total subscribers each DM me once every 2 weeks, so not super frequently, that is 92.8 DMs per day. So when you get a big following, you can't really expect a creator to respond. I mean, I used to be like, I would hear someone DM a creator and that they didn't respond, and I was like, man, this guy needs to like support his audience. Like they support him, he needs to be responsive, but it's just not possible. Like it's just overwhelming. And at a certain point, I was probably spending 3, 4, 5 hours a day answering DMs and explaining stuff to people all for free. Before eventually I was like, fuck this. This is not sustainable. And so I appreciate, it's part of the reason why I do these Q and A's, because you're helping 10,000, 20,000 people at once, and it actually scales a lot better. But if you send me a video of your squat form and are like, can you write an essay about what I should change? I mean, I just have to say no. And that's something I've gained the ability to do, and I still feel bad about it, but it's something that is necessary when you get to a certain point. And so, yeah, I'll get all kinds of questions. Some of them are entertaining. Some of them I will entertain and answer, but some of them I unfortunately have to pass up. And if you have DM'd me, don't feel bad about it. Don't feel guilty about it. It's important just to realize the scope and the scale of things. No content creator talks about that because it's like it's not a wholesome conversation, is it, right? Our next question, in what order is your preferred progressive overload? A, add weight. B, add rep or reps. C, add set. D, change of tempo. E, decrease rest period. Just curious, I enjoy there are many options on how to progression in general. I personally like to add weights last until I've used up all the other options, dynamic progression or Steve Shaw, big hairy ugly dude, progression options. I'm in no rush to get stronger or not competing in anything. Give space for cardio development if I choose to as well. Many thanks for all the great content. I have also learned a lot from you and so happy for the growth of your channel. Thank you. I would say that I have kind of the opposite mentality here than you. So for you, adding weight is like the last thing. After you've decreased the rest periods, you've totally changed the tempo and you're controlling it all the way, you've added in a bunch of sets, you've added in a bunch of reps, then you finally add weight. I would say I put the most value on adding weight because that is, to me, is true progressive overload, where you are actually increasing the load on the bar. B, adding a rep. This is very close behind. To me, adding weight and adding reps are somewhat interchangeable, right? Because if you add enough reps, you've gotten stronger, right? But not always. If you turn your 30 rep max into a 40 rep max, you might not actually be stronger in a more reasonable, moderate rep range because you might just be doing the reps a little bit more quickly. Well, I guess tempo is the same, but you might just be more endurant. I mean, your endurance has increased, but that doesn't transfer over to more muscle tissue always. So I would say adding weight and adding reps, a similar level, but adding weight is slightly in front of it. I would rather add weight than add reps, especially as you get towards higher reps. C, adding a set. I don't consider adding a set to even be progressive overload. It is in the sense that it's more challenging, but it doesn't mean you got better. Let's say you do 3 sets and you got 10, 9, 8 reps. Then you do a 4th set and you get 7 reps. Well, how do you know that you couldn't have done that before? Maybe you could have, right? Even with the same rest periods, you don't know if you could have done that or not, and so it's hard to actually compare. If you're just adding in a set, you might not have actually gotten better. You just sort of waited around in the gym for longer, right? And so adding in a set, it is more stressful, it is more training stress, but it's not necessarily a sign that you actually improved. D, change of tempo. I like to keep this more consistent, if at all possible. There is the logic in that maybe you allow your form to get a little bit sloppier, a little bit faster, you're not as controlled in the eccentric, and then later you do a form reset, you clean up your technique, and now you're doing the same weight, the same reps, the same sets for a slower tempo, a more controlled tempo, and therefore you've gotten better. I would say this is only done in hindsight if you messed it up, right? So if you're looking at your technique and you're like, man, these reps look really rushed, sure, maybe clean up your technique, but I wouldn't actively use that. I wouldn't say to a client, all right, we're going to start rushing these reps. We're going to start to really hammering through these reps so that we can add more weight and then we'll clean it up later. Yeah, I don't think that's really a very good idea. And then decreasing the rest period, I don't even advocate measuring this or managing this. I would say go by feel. And this does mean that you're going to have a little bit of inconsistency in terms of your rest periods. Maybe 1 week is 2.5 minutes, the other week is 3, then 3.5, then 2.5. But I think that's much better than trying to get the stopwatch out and really, if you're running intervals, you're doing, high intensity interval training. Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense to measure that very, very exactly and accurately and precisely, because that is part of the training effect that you're trying to get. And that is actually very, very important to performance. For lifting, yes, if you rest a little bit longer, maybe you can increase your performance, but I would not say that's a vector of manipulation, right? You're better off worrying about something else, the weight, the reps, maybe the sets, and then rather than trying to change the tempo or change the rest period. So if it's working for you, keep doing it. You don't even listen to me, but I would say for most people, weight and reps together, maybe sets if you need to, which would be a triple progression, and then tempo and decreasing rest periods, I would not worry about. Just try to have consistent, good technique, and then do your rest periods by feel. I would say for the vast majority of people, that is going to be the way to go. All right, next question. Any research confirming gelling works yet? Gelling like hair gel? I mean, we used to use hair gel when I was in high school. We used to think we were so cool, just, grabbing it, squeezing it, rubbing it in, and then, spiking it up, just grabbing it, tweaking it, twerking it, getting all kinds of cool styles and stuff, pretending that we were in sync or the Backstreet Boys, Backstreet Back's all right, that kind of stuff. I don't know why there would be research in it. It's kind of a weird question. Is this even fitness related? Let's see some of the responses to get some context. This was the most upvoted question. I don't know why gelling would be. Guess that's technically bodybuilding. Okay. Body lengthening. Lengthened position hypertrophy. What the? My science-based routine. What's that? I don't know what that word is, because I don't need that. Whatever that is. So yeah, thank you so much for the questions, except for that last one. Fucker. Yeah, if you want to support the channel, check out my books. They will help you a lot in your hypertrophy journey. Can't promise it'll be effective for every area of the body, but the muscles of upper body and most of the lower body, it should be quite productive. 2025, the hypertrophy book for that area will become. Anyway, thank you so much for watching, and I will see you in the next video. Peace.